It is a very difficult thing to get the balance right about the later British Empire. This dual, on the one hand, the patronising, class-based, arrogant, supercilious background to it, and yet in individual cases and in practice often something different. On the whole, I mean, if you could just elaborate a little further about your feeling about the empire and its role and position, it'd be nice to hear anything more you have to say on that.
Well, empires, Alan, are not static. They're changing all the time, and personnel who run the empires are also changing on the basis of education, the times they live in, the situation on the ground in that particular colony. I think the British were very different after the uprisings or the mutiny, whatever you like to call it, middle of the 19th century, when there were a lot of brutal things done on both sides, a lot of savagery. If you read Hodson's letter, you recall he says, congratulations. You remember someone congratulated him because Captain Hodson is the man who shoots the family, the Mughal emperor's entire male descendants, his sons, his grandsons, everyone is just shot in front of this old man. Now that kind of brutal act I find absolutely appalling, because here is the Mughal emperor who is then sent off to Rangoon to die, spend his last few years and die in a bamboo hut. But to have his sons and his grandsons and his male nephews and descendants all shot in front of him is really an act done in revenge and anger, if you like. It's a reaction to what was taking place at that time in the rest of the subcontinent, when the Indians were doing terrible things to the British, to women and civilians and so on. And then there's another phase, and that phase is the one I think that really impressed me. That is the phase in the 1880s, 1890s, and at the turn of the century, when now the British have an awareness that there is this jewel in the crown. The British considered India as the prized possession of the entire British Empire, and that they somehow had to maintain a standard. And that impressed me, because there was, I'm not an admirer of colonization of any kind, but there was a kind of moral authority here. And the example I can give you is of Lord Curzon himself, who, if you recall that incident up in Assam, I think it was, where there was some local woman molested by some British soldiers, some cook killed or beaten up by British soldiers, and the story was reported to Lord Curzon, who ordered an inquiry and then ordered the court-martial of the soldiers, and apparently the whole regiment was either sent to Rangoon or something like that, pretty drastic. And the result was a furor in the empire, because here after all was the pride of the empire, that's the British army. And here was Curzon prepared to stand up to this and say that if you remove this moral authority, then we are as good as our predecessors. And the argument was that we have to be better than them. Now this spirit, I believe, was communicated to the officers that I came in contact with decades later. People like Howell and Corot. They had this great sense of we are here to serve the people. And that's what really inspired and drove me and some of my generation, because we read about them. We were still fresh enough. I mean, the partition took place in 1947. We were already 66, so it's just 20 years on. It's not a lot of time. We still had gazetteers, we still had notes when we went to took over the charge of an assistant or deputy commissioner. The house was the same, some of the silver was the same, the paintings were the same. So in some senses there was continuity in spite of the disruption and the rupture that took place. And again I found that I could learn a great deal from these officers. The book that Howell wrote, Mij, for instance, has a remarkable conversation with an elder of the Masood tribe. And I think to myself, Howell is talking as a representative belonging to the Supreme Service, the ICS, to a tribal chief. And they're convincing each other of their respective civilizations. And Howell writes, not to the chief, because this is a secret document sent to the government of India in Delhi, he writes that after our prolonged conversations, I'm not entirely sure whether my colleague representing the Pashtun tribes, the Pathan tribes, is not correct when he says that A civilization is to be judged by the kind of men it produces. And leave us alone with the kind of people we have as were our fathers and grandfathers, and you keep your roads and your electricity and your telegraph poles, because in the end we are satisfied with what we are. And Howell acknowledges this. He acknowledges the fact that here's a culture, here's a civilization that needs to be respected. Now that is a remarkable tribute from someone representing one civilization to someone representing another civilization, and a remarkable tribute of the tolerance of someone like Howell. And I think that this kind of tolerance and insight would be very much appreciated in some of the interactions we have today when we have Western troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have so much misunderstanding and we have so many horror stories coming out of the prisons and the torture and the beating up and the complete collapse of any moral authority of these two civilizations interacting. And when I look at events today and compare them to the past, my respect for some of these individuals, not the system of colonization, but the individuals who ran the empire, my respect for them is maintained, and I am able to understand how the empire lasted as long as it did, and why there was still so much affection for these people in the rural and tribal areas of South Asia, irrespective of what the nationalist historians may say or may not say. I, as commissioner, when I was Commissioner Quetta, and I'd go into these remote areas and have what are called these big tribal gatherings, tribal meetings, and I'd start by asking the tribal elders, what can I do for you? And the tribal elders, very impressive biblical characters, would stand up and say, you are the greatest commissioner we have seen since the time of the British, and so on. This is standard, they say this to all the commissioners. And then they would say, you can do one thing for us, and that is get the British back. And I'd say, if I'm such a great commissioner, why do you want the British back? And they'd say, we want security, we want stability, we want fairness. And the British gave us that. And I would tend to agree with them that on the whole, you did have many, many officers who were remarkable, who were able to provide this and work around the clock for it. Unfortunately, some of us in South Asia have not been able to maintain that standard. So there are too many stories of incompetence, of corruption, of collapsing, of moral decay that take place and are heard today in our part of the world. So the great moral authority has been affected in terms of this civil service structure that I'm talking about.
Thank you. That was very moving. I've seen some of this in not the northwest frontier but the northeast frontier in my visit to Nagaland and Assam and elsewhere, where I was very influenced by my supervisor who had met many of these district officers. My supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, who had met Mills and Hutton and Hodgson and people like this. I think you mentioned you'd met Heimendorf.
Yes, Heimendorf was at SOAS, and I was then a student registered for my PhD. So I certainly met him. He was always very kind and courteous to me. My supervisor was Professor Adrian Mayer, and I'm delighted that both of them are on your list of ancestors, so I never suspected I joined them on any list, but here I am with them, and they were extremely kind and extremely attentive of my requests and needs, and at that stage questions, because I did want to do a regular standard anthropological PhD degree, and this is what I did, because I took a year off my studies on my work as a civil servant.
When was this? What year was this?
I joined in 1974 for a year at SOAS. I was on deputation from Pakistan on what's called study leave. Went back to the civil service, became a political agent and so on. But then I took a year off on my own and went into my fieldwork area, which was in the Momand area, because I really wanted to be as anonymous as possible. And very often with my wife, we went into and lived in these remote settlements and villages in the Momand agency, and collected a lot of very interesting data, which eventually became my PhD thesis. And that was published as Pushtun Economy and Society. And that was, of course, we were discussing anthropological works. That was very much a tome. It was an anthropological tome, which went into one edition and died a natural death, unlike some of my other work, which just continued, like Discovering Islam, which is printed and reprinted and reprinted ever since it was first printed. So that was actually my PhD thesis, Pakhtun Economy and Society.
Tell me something about Adrian Mayer, because you were obviously closer to him than to Christoph.
Adrian Mayer was my supervisor. He did his work in India. So his work was more in terms of Hinduism, the caste structure, the village, the Indian village. My my work was more Pathan tribes, tribal areas, lineages, political leadership among Pathan tribes, the role of religion, because religion is a very influencing, very strong factor among Pathans. They're very motivated and they consider themselves by definition Muslim, Islamic, not in an orthodox, very literal sense, but certainly in a sociological sense. So slightly different from the peoples he had been studying and dealing with. But again, I found him extremely helpful in terms of putting me on the right path in terms of the discipline of anthropology, the reading list, the comparative literature, and of course pointing out how important it is to keep the discipline of working on a PhD within a certain time frame. Now, I was again on a short leash because I had taken 6 months or 9 months from service in Pakistan. I was about to be posted as political agent Khyber, which is one of the best jobs in Pakistan because you're in charge of the legendary Khyber Pass, which is where all these great historical figures from Alexander the Great down to Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, have come into India. It's a very prized posting, and I had to make a choice again, a career choice. Do I stay on and become political agent, or come to the UK and do my PhD and finish it? And I, of course, came to the UK to do my PhD, and I never ever got the job because I gave it up before. But when I went back, I was then offered Waziristan, and so I went and took that particular job and found that that was something extraordinary, an extraordinary period of my life.
Right, Akbar. You've now become one of the chief explainers of Islam to the world, which is extremely important at the moment. I was wondering whether you could explain how you got into the position. You haven't mentioned your ambassadorial roles and other things like this. How did you become a wider than anthropologist spokesman for Islam?
Alan, the answer must come from something very personal in my life. My father, who I looked up to and admired and loved immensely, died when I was at Princeton. And just before he died, he had been persuading me to write on Islam. And there was a kind of tension developing between us. He was insisting I write on Islam because he said that is the great tradition of Muslim scholars. You need to be explaining the mystic, the tolerant, the compassionate nature of Islam, both to the West and to Muslims. And I was resisting because I would simply say, look, I'm an anthropologist. I deal in hard facts based in studies at the community level, small-scale societies, face-to-face relationships, ethnicity, tribe, village, and so on. To me, the job of the scholar of Islam is to be a man who is based or a woman based in a lifetime of study of the text, of the Quran, and so on. And I'm not that, and I will not be pushed or seduced or tempted into writing on Islam. So this was a kind of ongoing tension between us. And I then was told he wasn't very well. He was in Karachi, I was at Princeton. So to humor him, I scribbled a couple of paragraphs and said, well, all right, at some stage I'm going to do something on Islam. A world-shattering, earth-shaking book on Islam, which will explain the history and society of Islam. And I sent it off to him. And I then rang him from Princeton, asking him when he's going to be visiting us, and he said he'll visit in a few weeks' time. And next I rang him, I was told that he had passed away. And that came to me as a great personal blow, because it just shook me, because I wasn't expecting his sudden departure. And I remember walking into my study at Princeton almost in a trance, and a colleague of mine, who's a good friend of mine from India, an anthropologist, she asked me, she said, what are you doing? And I said, I was writing something, and I said, I'm writing a book on Islam. And she knew that what my own thinking was on the subject, and she said, but you're an anthropologist, what are you doing with Islam? And I just said, well, I'm going to now train myself to write on Islam. And that began a strange journey of my own into the world of Islam. I spent the next years traveling in the Muslim world. I, of course, went back to Pakistan, became commissioner in Balochistan of 3 divisions, so it allowed me to see Muslim societies in a different way, because now I was looking at religious training, at syllabi, at what was being taught in the madrasas, which would in the 1990s, in the next decade, become very important in the debate around Islam, and looking at Muslim political leadership based in religion, but all the while reading about Islam, traveling in the Muslim world. And at the end of it, I did write a book called Discovering Islam, Making Sense of Muslim History and Society, which was published in 1988. And that, in turn, was made into a 6-part television series by the BBC, which I presented, which was broadcast in 1993 when I was at Cambridge University as the Iqbal Fellow. I came here in 1988 to Cambridge. So there was a kind of logical progression of my interest in Islam. These things are never planned, but they somehow just look like logical and symmetrical when you look back at your life. And what I found was, when I arrived in Cambridge, the Salman Rushdie affair, the controversy around the satanic verses, was about to explode. And when it did explode, I was sitting in Cambridge, and once again I was just sucked into the debate on Islam. So suddenly I was on television and being asked to comment in all kinds of different forums and platforms on Islam. One particular incident I recall with Ernest Gellner, we were on one of these BBC late night shows, very distinguished panel with Ian McEwan and Antonia Byatt and so on, and Ernest, and they were all after me. It was 1989 or 90, I think, and they were sort of hammering at me and saying Islam is this barbaric religion, and you've got these savages and death threats and so on and so on. And I was finding it a very exasperating evening, because they were actually suggesting that Salman Rushdie is the new prophet of Islam, he's bringing a new kind of Islam, we should all follow that. When Ernest Gellner intervened, very clearly, very strongly, very sharply, and Ernest was like that. We were great friends, I had immense respect for him. And this was one of the times in public he came in. And when I came home to Cambridge late at night, we drove back with Ernest, driven by the BBC. I got calls from the Muslims who said, what a wonderful colleague you had, he spoke so well for Islam. And they said, as for you, why do you refer to him as Mr. Salman Rushdie? You should be abusing him, you should call him you mother so-and-so, you sister so-and-so. I said, look, this is not quite the way you talk on the BBC. It's not a good way of persuading people. And this problem then remained, because I continued to be involved in the public debate about Islam. With the success of the television series Living Islam, it gave me a platform to continue to write about Islam. I wrote a book called Postmodernism in Islam, Predicament and Promise, which was nominated for the Amalfi Award, and that in turn has just been reprinted. Then I wrote other books. I wrote books on Muslim political leadership based on the life of Mr. Jinnah. I made a feature film on Jinnah. I had a documentary on Jinnah, because I was asking myself, based at Cambridge, 2 big questions which people would be asking after September 11. I mean, these would be the central questions. What is the nature of Islam? Is it a violent religion? Is it a religion of tyranny, of anarchy, of threat and terror? Or is it a religion like the Abrahamic faith, rooted in essentially an idea of a world society which has to have a balance between compassion and piety, between tradition and the here and the now, and so on? The big question, number one. And number two, if this is the case, that we've defined Islam, then who's speaking for Islam? Is it the religious cleric? Is it the political leader? Is it the representative of the state? And in a sense, the 1990s for me was a decade in which I was involved in answering these questions in a very public way. So I was, from some anonymity, pushed or hurtled or thrust into a kind of limelight, where I was answering these questions in a very public way, and therefore also able to influence people, certainly in Muslim society and non-Muslims. In 1990, I was asked to come down from Cambridge to London, to the Royal Anthropological Institute, and give a lecture on Islam to Princess Diana. And I found that a fascinating experience. It's all recounted in a book called Diana, Her Last Love, which was published I think about 3 or 4 years back, a whole chapter on it. Diana I found very wonderful, very warm, very attentive to the talk on Islam. And when it ended, she came up and talked for a couple of minutes. I presented her my book, Discovering Islam, and she was so sweet. To any author's dream, she stepped out outside the Royal Anthropological Institute to a battery of cameras, and with the book facing the cameras, so that next day this glorious photograph of hers, and this was the time when she was still very much HRH, with her holding my book, was in every newspaper in England, and I believe my publisher Routledge called an emergency meeting to discuss what the fallout was in terms of publicity and the book that they had managed to get onto to the princess. So I found that the debate on Islam had now become not only confined to scholars on campus, but had begun to appear in public life in the West. Prince Charles, I was again very fortunate. I was involved with him to some extent in his understanding of Islam. I was with him at Oxford when he gave that famous talk on Islam in the West. I met him several times and was able to exchange ideas with him. And again, I found him very sympathetic and very understanding of Islam, and again attempting to reach out and create bridges. Later in the 1990s, I was much more directly involved, and again it was a logical progression in terms of moving from an anthropologist looking at small-scale societies and an anthropologist beginning to try to apply the principles that I had picked up as an anthropologist looking at these societies to a global civilization, and then a global civilization interacting with other civilizations. So when I was asked as the first Muslim to give the Rabbi Goldstein Memorial Award lecture at the synagogue in St. John's Wood, I think is the progressive and liberal synagogues of the UK, first Muslim ever. That event created great national interest, so television, radio, everyone was present, including the police, because a lot of young men on both sides were unhappy that this was happening, and a lot of tension in the air. But I turned up there with a large number of Muslims. Lord Nazir Ahmed was one of them. He'd just become a lord in the House of Lords, and we had a terrific reception. It was a full house. After I spoke, I had a standing ovation in the synagogue, and that helped to thaw relations between the Jews and the Muslims in the UK. Just before that, I think I was the first Oxbridge Don to speak at Evensong in Selwyn College Chapel. Once again, I had lots of Muslims. So all these attempts were being made by me in a sense as an extension of my own understanding of Islam, and in a sense an extension of my own father's vision of Islam as a religion of compassion and peace, embodied in this famous Sufi saying from South Asia, Sulle Kul, or peace with all. This was the great motto of the Sufis of South Asia, which my father believed in. And this was allowing me to play that particular role. And this was, of course, before I arrived in America, where from Princeton I came to Washington and took up the post of Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University in Washington in August 2001. And on September 11, I was in my class with a very distinguished guest lecturer talking about interfaith and understanding and so on, when students ran in and out. Some had cell phones, there was a look of horror on their faces, and they said these twin towers had been attacked and demolished, and Pentagon, and there was complete chaos after a while. And I suddenly realized that the topic of Islam, the subject of Islam, my civilization, my religion, would henceforth be at the center of the debate in the early part of the 21st century, because the necessity to explain Islam was now upon us as an urgent task and duty. And certainly for any Muslim scholar, there was no longer the option of sitting as a neutral scholar in the ivory tower writing learned and erudite texts about 12th century Sufi poetry, but that Muslim scholars had to be out there in exchanging ideas, interacting with people, and really explaining the nature of Islam in an attempt to calm things down and to create bridges. So in a sense, a lot of the last 2 decades was leading me to the point of September 11 and allowing me then to play the kind of role I was able to play, because immediately after that, it's been 3 years and I don't think I've had one peaceful 24 hours without some major media intervention. Before coming to you, I've done my BBC. Last night I've done my Voice of America. So this has been going on non-stop. And I'm supposed to be on holiday here at Cambridge with my daughter. So this has been largely a period, I feel, a period in my life in which I've been able to give back, as it were, to the community, to people I know, whatever little knowledge or whatever little learning I've had or experienced in my own life, in an attempt now to do something with this, these ideas and this experience and the knowledge I have.
Thank you very much. Well, that is very good to have. Just continuing on one or two of those themes. Firstly, Ernest Gellner. You said that he was very constructively helpful on one occasion, but you said to me, and he was a great patron of mine and friend, and we pursued the same intellectual puzzles for many years. Is there anything more you'd like to say about him?
I would, because Gellner and I had a very interesting relationship on one level, on an intellectual level. We worked very well together. We in fact did a joint project. I was asked by Routledge to write a book on postmodernism in Islam. And I suggested to Ernest, I said, how about doing it together? So let's both of us look at this. And he immediately responded positively, and I got my friend at Routledge, Dr. Chris Rojek, to come up. We had lunch at King's, and we in fact wrote up, he wrote his book, I wrote my book, and they're both still in print and doing well. On another level, a little known story, I came to start my PhD program at SOAS in the 1970s, completely unknown, from Pakistan, arrived at SOAS, and I wrote up, before my PhD, in a couple of weeks, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks exactly, a book called Millennium and Charisma Among Pathans. And with the gall and the cheek and the arrogance of the ignorant, I sent it off for publication to Routledge. And they said either this is going to be very good or it's going to be terrible. So they didn't want to take a risk. They circulated it and people weren't sure what to do with it. They even sent it back to my own department, and the department said, well, he is a student, he's here registered for a PhD, but whether he's in a position to write this book and have it printed, which in a sense is challenging some very established names like Frederick Barth on the Swat Pathans, we are not very sure. And I was saying something which I thought was very important, that the importance of religion, for instance, to Pathans, to Pashtun societies. I thought that was underestimated or overlooked by Barth, the importance of the Wali of Swat, and many other points I was making, and sometimes just getting ethnography plain wrong. I pointed all this out in the book, so it was still a little bit controversial coming from someone who had no status in the discipline, until the manuscript landed on the desk of Ernest Gellner. And Gellner not only stepped in, writing to Routledge, but Gellner said, not only will I support this, but I will write the foreword to the book. And Gellner's own book, if you recall, had a foreword by none other than Lord Bertrand Russell. So I was absolutely thrilled, and I never forgot this, because the psychological impact of having someone just stepping up and like a traditional guru who would do these things, so to say, well, here's the student, I'll support the student for whatever reason, made a deep impact on me. So that 20 years later, when I was asked by the Times to write a column, they have a column called Past Masters, Times Higher Education Supplement, I selected Ernest Gellner as my past master, and I pointed out as a kind of tribute to him what he meant to me as a guru figure. And I concluded that essay by saying that we are a very unlikely pair, because I'm from South Asia, I'm a Muslim, he's East European Jewish, he's a philosopher, of course an anthropologist, but primarily rooted in other disciplines. I'm a straightforward anthropologist, and yet when in our world, when people talk of figures so diverse, we can point to someone like Gellner and myself, where there is so much that is also in common. And what binds us is this great common humanity and mutual respect we have. So that was Gellner. He was a very modest man. I was given some kind of an award by the British Council and in Cambridge, and the Pakistan High Commissioner came up, and Gellner was there in the audience, and I acknowledged him. I said, I'd like to acknowledge my guru. I called him my guru, and predictably he squirmed with embarrassment, much to my delight. But I certainly miss him. I certainly miss him because I miss his integrity and his sharp intelligence and his friendship.
One further question which links Gellner and Islam. One of my abiding impressions from his book on Islam is that he felt that if you divided the world into systems where things had not been separated off, where religion and politics, religion and kinship, religion and economics were all fused with each other, if you have those kinds of systems, and you have a modern world in which you live with the divisions, that economics is economics, politics is politics, religion is religion, he put Islam on the side of the undivided world. In other words, politics and religion, which he mainly concentrated on, were fused together, which was a characteristic which shows why he was interested in it alongside his other great interest, which was in communism, which has the same ideology, and politics are fused together. And from this I interpreted him as suggesting that there is a serious problem, that this isn't confined to those two cases. Roman Catholicism is another example. Buddhism, to a certain extent, is another example. Hinduism is certainly another example. In other words, nearly all ideological systems that the world has ever known fuse politics and ideology. But the modern predicament and difficulty is to try and create a world in which these things are held sufficiently apart that you have enough autonomy within each realm. And therefore, I think he always felt that there was a fundamental difficulty in accepting an Islamic civilization, however much he respected it and loved it and was intrigued by it. He felt it was a closed, in his metaphor from Popper and others, it was a closed system, which therefore had difficulty in coming to terms with a divided modern world.
Yes, at the same time, if you recall, in Muslim Society and other works, he makes some very interesting comparisons between Islam as a system and other modern systems like Marxism. And he points out that whereas each system has been assailed by modernity and in a sense is either damaged or collapses or mutates or distorts or changes, Islam remains whole. And while it may have its weaknesses, and some you pointed out, it nonetheless manages to then survive as a whole. Because in some senses what he's saying is what the reality is, which is what I would say, that when you begin to chop up Islam, then it is no longer Islam. The dilemma for Muslims is how to preserve the essence of Islam and yet live in the world today. That is the challenge. It isn't so much to chop it up so that somehow it then fits into what we know as modernity. And this is an ongoing debate. I mean, I myself am now engaged in a precisely a similar study of comparative civilizations to come up with some answers. For instance, I find that Islam interacting with Judaism and Christianity in the Middle East is one civilization, and we are familiar with the Abrahamic civilization. So some of the arguments, some of the theological arguments, the doctrinal, the sectarian arguments are familiar. After all, we are working in a frame of reference which is very familiar to all three faiths, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. We may have our differences, we may have different ways of looking at whether it's Jesus or whether it's even the afterlife, but overall there is a great familiarity. Now you move Islam into South Asia, your region, and what do you see there? Islam, 1,000 years ago, it comes into a world where there's no notion of one God. There's a notion of caste. There's no notion really of the afterlife where you're going to be judged and you either go to heaven or to hell. There's a sort of much more cyclical way of looking at existence. You don't have revelation, you don't have prophethood, you have a very different world. And a world which is not only ancient, but sophisticated, cogent in terms of its arguments, its philosophy, its architecture, its art, its culture, and not easily swept. It isn't going to be either seduced or just swept aside, like Zoroastrianism is when Islam comes to Persia. So now Islam faces a different world civilization, which is in the majority in terms of population. So how does this world civilization, encountering another world civilization, react? And here are two responses. One is the militaristic, the martial, where you have the classic example of Mahmud of Ghaznavi, sword in one hand and some say Quran in the other hand, who comes in, smashes the temples, smashes the idols, and says, I'm Abrahamic, I'm going to impose my vision of the world on you. This is all mumbo jumbo, you worship stones, you worship elephants, and you worship snakes. And the other response, the more durable, the more permanent, the more universalistic, and the more, I believe, relevant today, is the response of the great scholars and saints of South Asia, as typified by Moinuddin Chishti at Ajmer. And they believe in the philosophy of Sole Kul, peace with all. And in essence they're saying we are creatures of the same God, different paths, but ultimately the same divine being that we all look to. And they go back to the Quran for references. And the Quran says, we have made you into different tribes and different nations. The Quran says there is no compulsion in religion. So there's a very strong theological base for what the Sufis are doing in South Asia. So once again you see two different distinct responses to a political reality which has been forced upon the Muslims because of the historical experiences that they are encountering at that particular time in history. We in the 21st century are looking around for what kind of Islam will endure, or what kind of Islam can we interact with. And I believe that this particular encounter that Islam has in South Asia has much to teach us in the 21st century. Because if you look around in the Middle East, you will not come across many examples of that kind of synthesis between an Abrahamic faith and a totally non-Abrahamic faith, like we do in India. You will not come across many examples of a genuine democratic movement, as was the movement around the Pakistan movement in the 1930s and 40s, led by Mr. Jinnah, who is above all a Democrat. You may like him, you may dislike him, but he symbolizes democracy, women's rights, human rights, the constitution, respect for law, and so on. He wants, his vision is a modern democratic state. Now you will not have many examples of either this sophistic synthesis or the democratic model provided by Jinnah and the Pakistan movement in the Middle East. And that is a problem, because the world, when they talk of Islam and they talk of modern Islam, the problems with Islam look automatically at the Middle East, and they look around the 22 countries, 300 million people, and say, where are the Democrats? Where is the tolerance? They are nothing but dictators. The landscape is littered with dictators, and we have a problem. Therefore, the need for scholars to constantly point out that it is a global civilization, and that there are many variations of it, and that it is in the process of change and adaptation like world civilizations, and that we need to be engaged with this particular debate taking place within Islam.
That seems like a very good point at which to temporarily halt our interview anyway. Thank you very much indeed, Akbar. That was fascinating.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much.